Hello, I'm Dr. Brian Fraser. In this video, we'll be covering how to use the GSON library produced by Google to deserialize a JSON file. And we'll be using the explicitly kind of managed structure. So we'll be going through and explicitly pulling out the data we're interested in. So first off, what is JSON? Well, JSON is a JavaScript object notation file, and it allows us to exchange data in a relatively easy to read format. So here I have a sample kind of JSON file that I've created for this demo, and we can see here that it's going to kind of encode some fields, and it also has an array as well. So if we look at the structure of this, it would correspond to the object that I've got shown here kind of in a diagram. There's two fields, the address and the cost, with the values shown, and then we've got a pets array here, and it encodes data into this. Now in this case, my array is actually an array of objects. So this might be some pets. The first one is this object here, and the curly braces denotes an object. And then the fields are here. We've got a name and a color field. And I've shown that in the picture on the left with a name, Rex, color red. And we can see here that there are three different objects inside of this array, and I've got three objects shown here in the object. Now the actual array versus array list or anything like that, it's somewhat agnostic. The JSON file is just happy to store a collection of objects encoding all the information. What you actually want to process it as is up to you. So what we want to do is we want to write a program that will take this JSON file, and it will then load it into our own custom objects. Now a common way of doing that is building your objects to mirror the structure you find inside of a JSON file. That's fine, it's very efficient to do so, but in some cases it's not a great idea. Specifically, I find when the JSON file's format is not at all what you want your object format to look like. So you've done your object-oriented design, and you've decided that maybe you don't want it to map whatever's in your JSON file. Maybe the JSON file has an unusual structure, too many subclasses, weird construction of things. You can get around things like naming of fields. That's pretty easy to manage with JSON, but we're going to say, okay, imagine you've got a file that doesn't conform to your version of reality. So let's go through and do that. We're going to go through IntelliJ and create a new project and process it. So inside of IntelliJ, I've said I want went to File and then said New Project. What I want to start off with is by saying I want a straight Java project. I'm not going to use Gradle or Maven at the moment. We'll actually go through and exploit some Maven functionality, but we'll just make a standard basic Java project. And then I can put it in a location, and let's call this one Deserialize. I don't need any of the other options, and then it'll create me a window which I will now bring into the appropriate location. So we're going to go through and configure IntelliJ, which is what I'm doing my development in, to work with the GSON library in order to make it all work. So to start with, let's add in a main file. File new, and then we'll create a Java class. Let's just call it main. And then we'll put in the usual main. Copy and paste for speed. So let's go through and say, well, what would we normally do? Well, we're going to actually process this when using something called a JSON element. And it's not built in, it's built into the JSON library. So my program doesn't know what that is. So let's go and teach it. So I'm going to go to File, and then Project Structure. And then under here, I want to go down to Libraries. I guess I want to add a new library, and I'm going to go from Maven. Now I need to know where to get this from. I've got to tell it where to look. The web is full of places to get data from. If I check the documentation on GitHub for the Google JSON library, under the download section it'll tell me here if you're using Maven, you want to pull it from this location. So I'll copy that, come back over here, paste, and search. And I think that should, oh, there we go. And now it gives me the options here what I want to pick. I'll pick the latest. At this point it's 2.8.6, and click OK. And sure, I'll take that into that project. Now what I can do is, so I can go edit this that I just pulled in, I can change the version of what I want to use. I could select latest, and that'll automatically update it to the latest every time I compile. That can be dicey. Some things get deprecated or removed, behavior can change, bugs can be fixed. We'll go with latest for now, just so it's forward thinking. Okay, so now we've got the JSON library all integrated into our system. So I might say I want a file element here. This is what I'm going to come back to later. So I'm going to start to process a file. Well, let's first off create that file. So I'm going to say I want a file. I'm going to call it input, and we'll say equals new file, and I'll give it a path. So I happen to know my file is at c:/t/data.json. So just a quick note, JSON is the file format, GSON is the library. So I'm going to say I want a file element, and I'm going to pull from this. This is going to come from my JSON parser as the class that I want to pull it from. And there's a method called parse, and I can pass it in a reader. Basically, I can pass it in a file reader. Let's do that. New file reader. New file reader. And I'm going to put in, pass to this, the path of the file I want. So that's just going to be my input. Oops. Input. Now, that's all well and good, except this is unhappy. It's going to throw an exception in certain cases. So if I hit Alt-Enter, and then I can pick what I want, I can say I'm going to throw exceptions. In this case, I actually want to handle it. So I'm going to say add try catch. And so now when I run this, I'm going to Shift F10. Nothing's going to happen, other than it will Control Shift F10. Let's try that. Yep. It'll compile, it'll run it, and nothing's going to output to the screen. Great. So let's go through the process here of working it. I'm going to, from my JSON element, my file element, I'm going to pull in a file object. I'm going to kind of convert this over to an object and start working with JSON objects. So I can say JSON object, JSON object, and I'm going to call this one, this is my file object, equals file element. From my element, I can get this as a JSON, so get JSON object. So now that I've got a JSON object to work with, I can start to do things. So let's start off by extracting the basic fields. If I go back to looking at my JSON format, I'm going to call these ones here my basic fields. They're just values. They're not arrays or extra objects, nested objects. They're simple to look at. So let's pull out the address first. So the address is going to be a string, and I can simply say my file object dot here. Now I don't want to get a string that's going to give me the whole file. I want to get one particular field. So I'm going to say I want to get, and I happen to know it's called address is the field that's in the file. And then on now, that gives me back an object. I want to get it as a string. So say get a string. We'll do the same thing for the other value, which is the cost. However, the cost is not a string, but it's a double here. I could tell it to give me a string and it'll convert that to a string for me, but I do want a double. So I'm going to say here double. In fact, the better idea is to go double of, and let's go with, let's call this one, I don't know, house cost. File object dot get, and it's going to be cost. So the name of my variable does not have to line up to what is in the file. That's one benefit of going through it explicitly. I don't have to worry about the mapping. And also I can kind of decide along the way, once I've got the data from the file, what I want to do with it in my program, rather than being locked into the object structure shown in the JSON file. Now why do I go with the capital D double? When you're processing JSON files, it's not a bad idea to skip the primitives. The nice thing about double, capital D double, is it could be null. And so in some cases, particularly if you're doing automatic deserialization into a class, if the value is not found, then it doesn't throw an exception, it simply gives you a null value. And so that's great for kind of forward or backwards compatibility and a few other things. So we'll just model that here. Okay, now let's just show that we got it. So I'm going to S out to print it to the screen, and address, and here's my address, and then I also have my house. Let's go cost. I'll line it up to look nice. Cost. And now when I run the program, with any luck, it will give me back the real values. So this is coming in from my JSON file. Very nice. Okay, so that's great for simple values, but what about more complex values? That's why we're really using JSON. We want the kind of complex object processing. So let's look at handling the rest of that. So what do we have here? We have an array called pets, and that array contains objects. So each object is a pet object. Now in this case, the object structure is going to really map to what is in this file. It's so simple. In other cases, you might have really weird things, like each pet comes in with a type, and the type refers to a gender, and who knows what else is going on. But we'll just go simply here. So I'm going to create a new class to store a pet in. Let's call it pet. And in here, we need to give it so string. I might have a name, and I'm going to have a string. Let's call it fur color. Just showing you that the names can be different. And I'm going to use Alt Insert for inside of IntelliJ to build myself all of the things I need, like my constructor, accepting both fields. And then I'm going to create getters and setters for both fields. And why not? Let's also create a toString, just so we can print it out to the screen and it all looks good. Okay, so this is basically my auto-generated class with a name and a fur color. Now let's go back over here. We're going to want to process that. So I'm going to say process all pets. Well, what do we need to do? So I need to go through, I need to get the array first off. So I'm going to get it, it's going to be a JSON array. And I'm going to call this one JSON array of pets. So this is going to come from my file object, and I can then say I want to get the pets object, and I'm going to say get me this as a JSON array. Now the nice thing about the JSON array is that it is iterable. What does that mean? That means I can go for each JSON element. I'll call this one pet element inside of my JSON array of pets, and I can process it. So first, let's go for, I'm going to convert, so get the JSON object. So this is going to be a JSON object, and let's call this one pet JSON object equals, and I need to do the same thing I did before, is get me a JSON element. So that's going to be my pet element dot get JSON object. So now this at least lets me start working with it. I can extract some data. And so this is going to be string name equals my pet JSON object dot get, and I'm going to get from this the name, and that was just the name of the pet, and then I can get it as a string. I have to put get a string because I can say, well, when I tried to extract a value, how do I want to treat that? A Boolean, a string, an array? The JSON format is very flexible, so I can put that in here. And let's repeat this, and I'm going to call this one color. I'm going to spell the variable name just to show that, well, maybe you might want to name this different than they did. So I get the color also as a string. That looks good. Let's just complete this. So I want to now create my pet. So pet equals new pet. And if I go Control P, it'll tell me all the different parameters I need. I need the name and then the color, the fur color. And at last I want to do something with it. Let's put it into an array list. So let's do a list of pets. I'm going to call this one pets equals new array list. I'll do this just so that I am always using polymorphism for the most general type I can. Create an array. Oops, I don't want to create that. I want to import, and it'll automatically import for me. And into pets.add, we're going to add pet. Okay, so now I've got my array list. Let's actually print it out. So print out, and I can simply do this by printing out pets. It will support a toString, so let's do this. All my pets are, and we'll print that out. So we've gone through, we've converted our object into a JSON array. We iterate through the array, grabbing the object first, and then from that JSON object, we're able to extract the fields that we're interested in. So we're extracting each of these fields one at a time under explicit manual control. Now when I run the program, we see here that we get it, and this is just what my toString is giving me. It says it's a pet object and all the different values that we pulled in. One thing to note is inside of my JSON file, if I want to do something like use a quote inside of my string, it has to be escaped. And the JSON library correctly unescapes it. And so, for example, Woofy here, Woofy big dog, it pulled in the quotes as expected. Okay, so that gives me the data in this. That's fine, except when you start to process an input file, something that can often go wrong is sort of an invalid file format or something like that. So let's look at what we could do wrong. Let's first off make an error in this file. It turns out JSON is incredibly picky about where things go, like an extra comma in here. It's not going to confuse us humans, but our GSON reader is not going to work well. So if I run my program again, oops, let me go back to that. I'm going to Shift F10, and we see that my program now dies a horrible death because it was an invalid file. As it turns out, I could go through and I could catch each one of these exceptions that it's going to throw, and it'll tell me specifically what's going on. But the problem is that I can get a bunch of nulls if the values are not found, if my code is not checking very carefully. A lot of things can start going wrong when I start to process this input. So while I don't often like to do this, I can just catch exception. And so this will catch all exceptions being thrown that I'm not otherwise catching here. And pretty much if it goes wrong, it means I've got some problem in my input file. So I might just want to do something like system.error.println error, error processing input file. And let's dump out my exception as well, just so I get a bit of a stack trace to help me out. And I can go up here, if I'm not finding the file, I can actually provide a more interesting error message on this. So error input file not found. And maybe if I was passing the file name in, I would put out an error message specific to what file it was. Now as it turns out, this captures a lot of what I want to do. In your program, you might want to do something more clever than simply print out, hey, there was a problem. You might want to handle it nicely. But let's see what we can do. So now if I run this, I've got an extra comma in my input file. Oh, that didn't work. Why did that not work? So oh, it did work actually. Here's my thing, error processing input file. So it actually ran my code, and then I printed out the exception anyway. A few other things that it can catch, for example, what happens if I intended my cost, I wanted to read out an integer, but instead if I put in like big bucks. That's also going to generate an exception here. And in this case, it's also a... Oh, wait, we still have the comma, don't we? There we go. Get rid of that comma. I think it's now a number format exception or something. Yeah, no, malform expression. Unterminated array. Have I messed that up? Let's try that. Let's go back here, make sure we're not messing up with two different errors. Check my commas quickly. They all look okay. And rerun this. Nope, unterminated array at line 9, line 9. Oh, here we go, missing that column. Okay, so now if I go here and I tell my cost is big bucks, rerun, error processing input file, number format exception. So a lot of these sorts of errors are going to come in here. One last one that I might want to handle is what happens if I didn't specify something. So for example, what happens if one of my dogs down here, my pets, didn't specify a color? Just it wasn't provided in the input data that someone else was processing, so it's not in this JSON file. At the moment when I run my program, it's explicitly looking for it, and so it fails. It gives me a null pointer exception because it wasn't found. So we can check for that. So I can come in here, and instead of just blindly getting it, I can say, give me under, so if pet JSON object dot has, so if this has a color member, then I can do something intelligent with it. And what I want to do is start off by initializing my color to nothing, to null, and then if it's found, I'll actually set it. And so this will handle the case of if the value is not in the input file, then it'll handle it right. And if I look over here, fur color comes out to be null, as we kind of like, because bingo was not provided a fur color. This is also useful up here, for example, with my cost. I said we were going to do it for a house cost as a double, capital D double. So I can say if my input file, so the file object dot has, if this has a cost, then I can grab the value. Otherwise, leave it as null. And now if I go over here and let's just rename this cost, new name. So now when it tries to get the cost value out of it, it's not found, and my code can handle that. It can work with it as a null. If I just set it as a double lowercase d, I'd have to represent it with like a negative value or something that would indicate that this value was simply not found in the input data, which is hard to work with. Okay, so that's all I wanted to show for today. Again, this method is applicable when you don't want to conform your object structure to the structure found inside of the JSON data. If you appreciated this video, go ahead and click like or subscribe. Look for my other videos around for how to process, how to work with generating a jar file from inside of IntelliJ to run this as sort of a full package. Thanks for watching.